Good evening. Well, thank you first and foremost to Bruce Roeder, who brought us here with his idea. Thank you to Thomas Bass. You're a foremost educator. I've learned a few things tonight. I learned that Blair Horner, who I've known for 8 years, served in the Army. I've learned that Frank is our latter-day Sherlock Holmes, having advised London, so we have to make a conclusion. I learned that Zephyr Teachout is, I'm waiting to see you and waiting for Godot, Zephyr, based on your previous Beckett experiences. And I learned that the benefit of having the least distinguished CV of sitting on a panel is that they can't roast you nearly as much as they can. So, Thomas, thank you very much for telling me that. And thank you to my fellow panelists for laying out a history of corruption, for efforting at some definitions for corruption, for offering solutions for corruption. As a journalist, that's something it's not necessarily within my purview, but I think that there's a lot of fuel for discussion. And I wanted to open my remarks here, not in the present day, which I want to get to rapidly, but I want to go back 100 years. And I want to point out this book. This was, you can't see it, it's a blank book, but it's, this is Plunkett of Tammany Hall. This is a book that maybe some of you are familiar with. And for me personally, this was something of a book that was an epiphany for me. I read this in high school. A substitute teacher actually told me that I should read this book. And it was an eye-opening event for me because it explained for me politics as it really was. Not politics as I perceived it. Not politics as we are taught on, the Schoolhouse Rock videos or even by our civics teachers in public schools. But politics as it really was. And I wanted to open with a quote, if I may, from the book. And I'm going to do a horrible New York accent until I stop doing it. The books are always right. The money in the city treasury's all right. Everything's all right. If they can show is that Tammany heads of departments looked after their friends within the law and gave them what opportunities they could make to make honest graft. Every good man looks after his friends, and any man who doesn't isn't likely to be popular. If I had a good thing to hand out in private life, I'd give it to a friend. Why shouldn't I do the same in public life? And that, of course, was George Washington Plunkett, a state senator who represented the Upper West Side of Manhattan, served for many years, and who opened up to a journalist named William Reardon as he was getting his shoes shined about 100 years ago, about 1905 when it was published. And so I want to flash forward 110 years to something that's a very poignant quote. It's attributed to Preet Bharara in February of this year, but I assume, like all great quotes about Albany, it was actually something that Blair Horner said at some point over the course of his advocacy. But this is Preet Bharara. I'm sure you hear this a lot, but the scandal in Albany isn't what's illegal, it's what's legal. And I think that's the point of what we're talking about here tonight, right? We all know what's illegal. We know what bribery is. We know we have clear guidelines for behavior and criminal behavior, but what we have a paucity of, I think a very clear argument can be made, is public ethics. And so I wanted to talk about last week, and I wanted to talk about today. $147 billion, $156 billion, 9:35 a.m., is that about right for when you went home on Friday? 9:35 a.m. the New York State Senate adjourned. Senator Kruger's still recovering in the back. Thank you, Senator. But $156 billion. And of that pot in our new state budget, I'm focused on a few numbers. $1.5 billion and $400 million. Now, $1.5 billion is something called the State and Municipal Facilities Program. How many of you have heard of this? Of course, we have one smart guy in the back. But of course, no one has heard of this program. Why would anyone hear of this program? And the second one is the Transformative Investment Fund, $400 million. Okay, again, no one's really heard of this. What we have, and what we think we know about government is that we elect legislators, they put together a spending plan, they come up with ways to spend our money, our tax money. They put together a plan. They decide that we're going to spend roughly $25 billion for schools this year, aid to public schools. They decide that within that pot there's going to be some money for charter schools. They decide we're going to spend about $21 billion over the next 5 years for roads and bridges. We're going to send $27 billion to the Metropolitan Transportation Fund. And we're going to do $1.5 billion of miscellaneous things. Right? So what I didn't understand, and I've been covering Albany as a journalist for 8 years now, is that there are major chunks of the budget that are not specified. There are things which even I as a taxpayer have to work my damnedest just to find out where my own money is being spent. So let's talk about the State and Municipal Facilities Program. Now, how many people here have heard of member items? That might be more familiar to an Albany audience. Member items is the Albany term for earmarks. We hear about them in Congress. Or if you want to deride them, pork. The idea is basically that rank and file legislators, be they Republicans or Democrats, have the ability to mark government funds and send them to something, a worthy nonprofit, a museum of political corruption, for example, if there were such a thing that could be receiving a member item. And the theory behind this is that lawmakers are the best in touch with their districts. They know the needs, they know which Little League needs the money, and they know which soup kitchen could use the upgrade, and they direct the funds. Now, this program and this idea has been fraught with peril, and no one has been a louder voice against it other than the 56th governor of the state of New York, previously the Attorney General of the state of New York, Andrew Mark Cuomo. And so when he came into office, he came at the end of a fiscal crisis because in 2009, the state essentially ran out of money, and Governor Cuomo's predecessor, David Paterson, put the kibosh on member items, basically for fiscal reasons, not I don't think out of any stand of good government. David Paterson wasn't known for stands for good government, generally speaking. So Andrew Cuomo came in and he stood up and he said, we have to end this. This process is fraught with peril. You're not giving it to the soup kitchen, you're giving it to the Museum of Political Corruption because it employs your brother-in-law or your sister-in-law. And actually she's kicking you $10,000 on the side. You're getting rich on the side. And we saw case after case after case of this being laid bare by our state and federal prosecutors. So we thought this was over. In comes the State Municipal Facilities Program. Now, it started off small, $385 million in 2013. And then another $385 million in 2014. And then another $385 million in 2015. And never mind that we didn't actually spend that $385 million because, you know, the first rule of government spending is why have one when you can have three at 3 times the price? So it only makes sense to keep appropriating yourself more gains. And now, what is this money for? What is this money for? If you'll permit me. I went to the actual statute, if you'll permit me. For payment of the capital costs of constructions, improvements, rehabilitation, or reconstruction of facilities owned by eligible entities, the acquisition of capital facilities and assets, protecting infrastructure, preserving and protecting infrastructure, heavy-duty road maintenance and construction vehicles, pavers, snowplows, street sweepers, heavy-duty fire, emergency response, and law enforcement vehicles, economic development projects sponsored by the state or municipal corporations that will create or retain jobs in New York State, environmental projects, water and sewer district, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, a college or a university, my goodness, public school districts, public housing authorities, public libraries and library systems, public park conservancies, page 2, not-for-profit fire districts, fire commissions, fire companies, fire departments, volunteer rescue, and ambulance squads. So, I would argue that's everything. I don't know if you missed anything, but I would argue that that's everything. And so then the question becomes for someone like me, or maybe for a taxpayer like you, well, how are we deciding where this money gets spent? How are we deciding where these projects go? And that's when you kind of get the blank wall of Albany. And this is the other part of state government that I think is frustrating as a journalist. It's probably more frustrating as a taxpayer. And as an advocate, I think it's one of the things that the temperature that it makes Blair Horner's blood is why he looks so damn young. So, the answer is lawmakers were earmarking this all along, and they just never bothered to tell the public. So 2 years after they had been appropriating this money, we found out that lawmakers were earmarking it, that rank and file legislators had a say. And so, okay, well, let's see who is marking the projects, and how does that break down? So my organization, Politico, used the Freedom of Information Law. We basically threatened to sue the state legislature, knowing that we would win because there had been a previous case in which the Albany Times Union, my prior employer, had sued the state legislature for similar information and had won. So they cost up the list. Let me tell you who the big winners are, because I don't think it was the soup kitchen with the most broken oven. The king of the earmarks was Jeff Klein, the esteemed senator from the Bronx, leader of the Independent Democratic Conference. He won $11.7 million in earmarks. Now that is 3 times the next closest state senator. 3 times. The next closest state senator was Dean Skelos, a Republican from Long Island, soon to be a Republican from a federal facility, perhaps in New Jersey. And it goes on and on and on and on. So you ask, wow, this guy Jeff Klein, does he have a high needs district? Why is this money going to the Bronx? And, why didn't any Democratic districts get any money in the state Senate? Did they not have any need? What's going on? I suspect that politics were afoot, but I can't prove it as now. And so, for people who don't know, the reason is that Klein is allied with the Republicans, and through his alliance, he enables them to stay in power. And so, as a result, money and manna from the heavens. But it's no different in the State Assembly, which is a Democrat-controlled chamber. In the State Assembly, we broke down the numbers. $34 million went to districts that were represented by Democrats. How much do you think the Republicans got? Give me a guess. Come on, somebody give me a guess. Give me a number. 10 million. What else?
2.
50 million.
2.
I heard 2, which is the correct answer. 34 million to 2. So, okay, I think that we might have an issue with these discretionary funds, which my editor says I have to call discretionary funds on first reference before saying that everyone calls them slush funds, because that's arguably what they are. But if the state and municipal facilities program was a little bit too restricted for you, fear not. There's another fund. It's called the Transformative Investment Fund, which is great. I love transformative investments. I'm glad that we have a fund for transformative investments. May all our investments be transformative. So, now the Transformative Investment Fund was birthed last year. It's one of those things in budget negotiations where you have months worth of hearings, you have thousands of pages of an executive budget proposal, and you think you understand what's in the state budget, but then what happens is the bills get introduced and they become public. And you're looking through them if you're one of the complete dorks like me who actually gets paid to read through these bills the minute they're introduced in the several hours before they're actually enacted into law, and Happy April Fool's Day, here's your budget, New York. And so I was looking through the capital projects bill, and one of the big initiatives of Governor Cuomo last year was something called the Upstate Revitalization Initiative, maybe the Upstate Hunger Games. Anyone hear about this? Maybe you did, because Governor Cuomo's been big about talking about how he has been invested more money than any governor since DeWitt Clinton when he made the Erie Canal and the sliced bread factory, which makes him the best governor for upstate New York, really since it was founded, whenever that was. We don't need to put a date on it. And so $1.5 billion doled out in an economic development competition was a big deal. But, where is the locus of legislative power in this state? Is it upstate? No, it's New York City, and it always will be, because the bulk of the state's population, almost 50% of it, lies within the 5 boroughs of New York City. And the numbers are even more tilted if you go on Long Island and add Long Island in there. And so a man named Dean Skelos, remember the esteemed senator from the federal facility in New Jersey, he said essentially in closed-door negotiations, what's my piece? And lo and behold, when the final budget was introduced in 2015, the Transformative Investment Fund was born. The only projects that would be eligible for its funding would be in New York City on Long Island, those who were not eligible for the Cuomo funds. And now, if you'll permit me to read, this, again, because if the State and Municipal Facilities Fund is too restricted, we have a much shorter definition for the TIF. Hereby appropriated for the payment over a multi-year period of capital costs for regionally significant economic development initiatives that create or retain jobs. All right. That includes those that, quote, catalyze private investment, grow commercial and residential tax bases, and enhance the environment and quality of life. Who could be against this? Who could be against it? So, I've been writing a lot about this, and I think I'm out of time, but otherwise I would tell you the story of the Empire Outlets Mall, because it's a great story on the North Shore of Staten Island, which combines these 2 lovely slush funds, as well as the healthy $85,000 in campaign contributions that its developers gave to Governor Cuomo before the money started flowing. These are all correlations. It's just a misunderstanding. There's no connection, of course. Because it's a great story that I think really encapsulates the story here, but I don't think I have time to do that. So let me just say that after writing about this, after beating the drum, after having Blair Horner's blood temperature rise another 15 degrees, after having Senator Krueger jump up and down on the Senate floor, what do you think happened? What do you think happened in the state budget that was approved last week? Do you think that finally some sense of perhaps opprobrium or shame overtook our lawmakers? Do you think that they maybe amended? Do you think that they perhaps took the bill that was introduced by some lawmakers? Some lawmakers heard about this and were so offended that they introduced legislation that would require projects to be lined out from the budget, right? To prevent the correlation between funds going to campaign contributors, to prevent the partisan sort of spoil system that breaks down. That didn't happen. I looked at the budget bill this weekend. I only slept for 3 hours on Thursday night. That's probably 2.5 hours more than Senator Krueger did. And the answer was that in the state budget that was adopted, as a nod to transparency, as the only arguable action of government reform in this year's state budget, a little less than half of the Transformative Investment Fund projects were lined out. Asterisk. Subject to the approval of the budget director, who may retransfer the funds at any time if he or she deems fit. So, Pyrrhic victory. And then I looked at the state municipal facilities program. I had listened to my legislative leaders say, you know, guys, we're putting the budget in at the last minute, but it doesn't matter because the public knows. The public's been talking about this great minimum wage hike. We've been talking about the system of paid family leave. We all know we need more education funding. We all know that there's a dispute about what to do with costs to the city of New York. So there's nothing new in this budget. Guys, there's nothing new. Except the $385 million that we added to the slush fund. So congratulations, New York. Your SAM fund is now $1.5 billion. Let me be the first to break the news. You know, Blair, just a minute ago, you said there's a direct relationship between secrecy and corruption risk. And you know, as a journalist, again, it's not my job necessarily to try and advocate for a solution. It's something of a kind of a weird amalgamation of going from an objective reporter to an opinion reporter, even though I probably blow that distinction up far too regularly as I should. But I just want to close with the idea that we get the government that we deserve as citizens. And I'm a citizen. I was born in this state. I was educated in this state. I'm raising a family in this state. I'm probably going to die in this state. And I love this state. I want our government to be great. I want a government that I can be proud of. I want to know with confidence that when I sign my tax bill, that my funds are being spent with some modicum of efficacy and fairness. And my own opinion is that the more people understand what goes on in our state capital, and the more people understand what goes on in our government, the better our government will be. So I think you're about to hear in a few minutes a bunch of ideas for solutions. Some of my fellow panelists have thrown out their ideas. My 2 cents on that are the more sunlight, the better. And with that, I thank you for your time. I'm Michelle.